Ever feel like you're constantly trying to keep up with the world? Like there's just so much happening and so much to understand. I think we all feel that way sometimes. That's why we do these deep dives. We take one big important topic and try to unpack it in a way that helps you see the big picture.
And today, we're going to tackle something that might surprise you. It's something we all kind of think we know about, but maybe haven't really questioned: the future of global population.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most people, when they hear population, they immediately think overpopulation.
Right, like it's this ticking time bomb.
But we're actually going to look at the arguments laid out in Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, and see if those anxieties about an exploding population are really still valid, or are we maybe looking at a completely different scenario, a potential decline?
This is a really interesting question, and it gets at something pretty fundamental about how we see the future. So we're going to explore those different predictions, the factors driving them, and what it all might mean.
It feels like this idea of a population crisis has been around forever. You know, those classic images of a planet crammed with people.
Yeah, for decades, the image of a world bursting at the seams has been a powerful one.
It's totally seeped into our culture, even our entertainment. I mean, think about Soylent Green, set in a dystopian 2022, with 80 billion people facing ecological disaster and surviving
Fashionable. And Inferno, where scientist tries to unleash a virus to wipe out half the population because of overpopulation fears. These stories have definitely shaped how we think about the issue.
Absolutely. So before we get into what Empty Planet says, let's go back to the roots of this whole population crisis idea. Where did it all begin?
Well, a lot of it goes back to Thomas Robert Malthus, back in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. In 1798, he wrote his famous essay on the principle of population, and it had a huge impact.
Okay, Malthus, right. So what was his basic argument?
His core idea was that population grows exponentially, meaning it doubles with each generation, while food production only grows linearly. And that difference, he argued, would inevitably lead to, well, he called them positive checks on population. Things like famine, disease, war, all as a result of resources becoming more and more scarce.
So basically, he saw a pretty grim future for humanity's ability to feed itself as the population increased.
Exactly. And he also had a pretty dim view of efforts to help the poor, arguing that aid would actually make things worse in the long run because it would just encourage more population growth without addressing the underlying resource problem.
That does sound pretty harsh, especially from today's perspective. But, his predictions of widespread famine in Europe, for example, didn't really come true on the scale he imagined, did they?
No, they didn't. There were a few major developments that kind of proved him wrong, or at least the way things played out in many parts of the world. One was the agricultural revolution in Britain, which was happening right as he was writing. It brought all these innovations in farming. You had people like Charles Turnip Townsend, who introduced crop rotation, and Jethro Tull, who invented the seed drill, and selective breeding of livestock really took off. This all led to a massive increase in food production.
So they found ways to get more food from the same amount of land.
Exactly. And then you had the Industrial Revolution. That brought a wave of technological advancements that boosted efficiency, not just in agriculture, but in all sorts of industries. Ultimately, that raised living standards, and food production was able to keep pace with, and often even exceed, population growth. It's worth noting that Malthus was writing before the first official British census in 1801, but even then, the population was growing significantly, which is important. And those revolutions in agriculture and industry were key to supporting that growth.
Okay, so Malthus's doomsday scenario didn't exactly unfold, but those anxieties about overpopulation didn't disappear, right?
No, definitely not. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you've got Paul R. Ehrlich and his book, The Population Bomb, published in 1968. It really reignited those fears.
The population bomb, it even sounds alarming. So what were Ehrlich's main predictions?
He had painted a pretty bleak picture. He predicted massive famines in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in developing countries, as populations grew faster than food production. He also warned about resource depletion in developed countries.
He was certainly sounding the alarm bells, and he even proposed solutions, didn't he?
He did. And they were pretty radical, too, who even advocated for coercive measures to control birth rates.
Wow, that's going pretty far. So why didn't his predictions come true? I mean, we haven't seen famines on that kind of apocalyptic scale.
Again, a few things happened. The big one was the Green Revolution. It was this period of huge advancements in agricultural technology. We're talking synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, high-yield crops, and even genetic modification. It's pretty amazing. Between 1950 and 2010, Global food production tripled while the population only doubled, and the amount of farmland we used only increased by about 30%.
That's incredible. So we figured out how to get a lot more out of the land we were already farming.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about food. The economic rise of countries like China and India also played a huge role in reducing global poverty. Think about this. In 1980, China's per capita wealth, adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP basically, accounting for the cost of living differences between countries, was only $205. By 2016, it had jumped to $8,523.
That's a staggering increase.
It is. And it meant that something like 80% of China's poor were lifted out of poverty in just 4 decades. India's story was a bit different, but they also saw big economic gains. Their per capita GDP in 1960 was actually higher than China's at $304, but by 2016, it had reached $9,860. It wasn't the same explosive growth as China, but it still shows how much things changed.
So economic development played a big role in lifting people out of poverty and maybe easing some of those pressures on resources.
Right. And globally, poverty rates have plummeted. In 1800, something like 85% of the world was living in extreme poverty. By 1950, that was down to 55%, and today it's around 14%. And early warnings about ecological collapse in developed countries due to pollution, well, that hasn't really panned out either. We still have big environmental challenges, but air and water quality in many developed nations have actually improved a lot. For instance, in the U.S., emissions of nitrogen dioxide are down 60% since the 1980s, and sulfur dioxide emissions are down 80%. And look at the Great Lakes, they've really recovered since the U.S. and Canada signed that agreement in 1972.
It's a good reminder that sometimes those really dire predictions don't account for human ingenuity or the impact in policy changes. But those worries about population and the environment didn't stop with Ehrlich, did they? I remember the limits to growth was a pretty big deal back in the 70s.
The limits to growth, yeah. That was published in 1972 by the Club of Rome. They took a different approach, but came to some similarly bleak conclusions. They used computer models to predict a societal collapse within 100 years because of interconnected issues. Population growth, industrialization, pollution, limited food production, you name it.
And they had some pretty specific timelines for that collapse too, right?
Yes, they did. They initially predicted declining per capita industrial output by around 2010, rising death rates by 2020, and then the global population would start declining by 2030.
So obviously those specific predictions haven't happened, but I think the limits to growth is still pretty influential, and there have been updated versions, haven't there?
There have. And those updates still suggest that we're on a path toward major problems unless we make big changes to how we consume and produce. More recently, books like Joel Bourne's The End of Plenty have also raised concerns about reaching peak food production because of environmental damage.
So that underlying concern about the planet's carrying capacity, its ability to support a growing population, just keeps popping up, even if the specifics change. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the UN. They're kind of the official source for global population projections.
Yeah, the United Nations Population Division, or UNPD, is the main organization that forecasts those trends. And historically, they've been pretty accurate. For example, their projection for the year 2000 was 6.28 billion, and the actual population was 6.06 billion.
Not bad. So what's their current medium variant projection? I think that's considered their most likely scenario, right?
Right. So their medium variant projects that the global population will reach 8.6 billion in 2030, then 9.8 billion in 2050, and it'll peak at 11.2 billion around 2100. After that, it kind of stabilizes and maybe even starts to decline a little.
So according to their main projection, we're still looking at significant growth this century. But I understand they have other projections too, different scenarios.
Yeah, they do. There's the high variant, which predicts a pretty mind-boggling 17 billion people by 2100, and the population would still be growing at that point.
Wow, okay.
And then there's the low variant, which says we'll peak at 8.5 billion around 2050, and then actually decline back down to 7 billion by 2100.
So we could end up back where we are today, population-wise, after all that.
Exactly. Pretty different futures, right?
Totally. Now, John Wilmoth, the former director of the UNPD, had some interesting thoughts on how reliable these projections are, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He had a lot of confidence in the medium variant because of what he called recency bias. Basically, the idea is that if you look at countries that have gone through similar development paths in recent history, you can use those trends to predict what's likely to happen in the future.
So the idea is that the future will probably look a lot like the recent past in those comparable countries.
Okay, but Empty Planet and some of the other sources we've looked at present a different view of the possibility of population decline. Let's unpack that argument and the evidence behind it.
Okay, so the argument for decline is gaining traction, and it's based on some emerging trends and data. One of the key figures in this camp is Wolfgang Lutz from the Vienna Institute of Demography. His central idea is all about education, especially for women. He's famous for saying that the brain is the most important reproductive organ.
That's a great quote. What does he mean by that? He's saying that when women have better access to education, information, and economic opportunities, they tend to make different choices about family size. They often choose to have fewer kids and have them later in life. And he believes this trend, which is driven by female empowerment and the ability to control their fertility with contraception, is pretty much irreversible. It's a shift away from focusing just on resource scarcity and toward looking at the power of education to shape population trends, which can lead to some surprising outcomes.
So it's not just about economics or resources directly, but about women having more agency, more control over their lives, and making different choices when they have more opportunities.
Exactly. And this aligns with projections from groups like IADESA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. They suggest that the global population could level off and then start shrinking by the middle of the century, maybe even as early as 2060. Even Jürgen Randers, who co-authored The Limits to Growth, has changed his mind. He now thinks the population will peak at 8 billion around 2040 and then decline, mainly because of urbanization and the fact that there's less economic incentive to have big families in cities.
It seems like there's a growing number of experts who are less worried about runaway population growth and more concerned about the opposite.
Yeah, there is. The Economist, for example, has expressed some doubts about the UN projections, pointing out that fertility rates have dropped a lot faster than expected in countries like Bangladesh and Iran. And Hans Rosling, who came up with the peak child concept, argued that the number of children born globally has already stabilized at around 2 billion and will probably stay there. He believed that a stable global population of around 11 billion is sustainable if we keep making progress on education and healthcare. Even Deutsche Bank has projected that the population will peak at 8.7 billion in 2055 and then decline to 8 billion by the end of the century.
Okay, so what are the main factors driving these declining birth rates? It sounds like urbanization and female empowerment are really key.
They're definitely the big ones. Urbanization changes the whole economic equation of having children. In rural agricultural societies, kids often represent an economic asset because they can help with farm work. But in cities, they're more of an economic liability. They need education, healthcare, all that, and they're not contributing to the family income directly. At the same time, when women have more access to education and economic opportunities, they gain more control over their lives, and they tend to delay marriage and childbearing. They just want smaller families. And of course, access to contraception is essential for making those choices a reality.
It's a pretty fundamental shift in how societies work and in the roles that women play. So we've gone from these historical fears of a population explosion to a growing possibility of a decline. That's a pretty big turnaround.
It is. So going back to the question we started with,
Okay.
are we headed for an overpopulated planet or one where the population is actually shrinking?
Right. We've got the UN's medium projection, which says we'll keep growing for a while before things level off. But we've also heard a strong counter-argument, backed by a lot of experts, that we might see a peak and then a decline, mostly because of women having more opportunities and the trend toward urban living.
And it's really important to think about what either of those scenarios would mean. Continued growth, even if it eventually levels off, or a peak followed by a decline, both have huge implications for things like the economy, global power dynamics, and the environment. We'll definitely have to explore those issues in more detail in future deep dives.
For sure. And here's something to think about. For most of human history, we've been a species defined by growth, by expanding our numbers. What happens to us, to our societies, if that trend reverses? What kind of changes might we see in a world with a shrinking population? It's a pretty profound question.
It is, and it's one worth pondering as we move into the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back with more explorations of these big, important topics soon.